Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below, and if you believe dignity should never be optional, hit like and subscribe. Now, back to Margaret Hayes. At 72, she had learned how to make herself smaller in a world that kept asking her to disappear. But that Tuesday morning, standing inside First National Bank with a worn leather purse pressed to her chest, she refused to bow her head. Her silver hair was gathered into a neat bun. Her navy coat was clean but faded, and the shoes beneath her skirt had seen too many winters. Yet her posture was straight, almost proud, as though the years had taken everything from her except the right to stand tall. She had walked 3 miles to get there. 3 long miles, because bus fare and medicine had both become luxuries she could no longer afford in the same week. Inside the bank, the air smelled like polished stone, expensive perfume, and quiet impatience. Men in tailored suits moved through the lobby with their coffee cups and their confidence, while Margaret waited her turn beneath the bright white lights that made every wrinkle, every tremor, every dollar in her envelope feel exposed. She was not there for charity. She was there to deposit money she had earned the hard way. Through 50 years of scrubbing floors, washing dishes, and cleaning homes before sunrise so other people could wake up to comfort. The envelope in her hands held the last of what she had saved to pay the property taxes on the little house her late husband had left her, the only place left on earth that still felt like a memory with walls. When her number was finally called, she stepped to the counter with careful dignity and placed the envelope in front of the young bank manager. His name tag read Brandon Mitchell, and his smile had the polished emptiness of someone who had never once had to apologize for where he came from. Margaret offered him a warm, polite greeting, the kind she had used all her life, the kind that assumed respect would be returned. Instead, Brandon picked up the envelope with 2 fingers, as if her money might stain him, and glanced inside with a look of immediate suspicion. The change in his expression was small, but not small enough to hide. He looked at the cash, then at her, then back at the cash, and something cold settled over his face. Margaret felt the first warning in her chest, that familiar tightening she had known from too many moments in her life when someone decided her age, her skin, or her clothes gave them permission to judge her worth. Around them, the bank kept moving in soft footsteps and low murmurs, but at that counter, the air had started to change. Brandon straightened behind the counter, trying to recover the polished confidence that had slipped from his face the moment he saw who was standing behind her. He cleared his throat, adjusted his tie, and lowered his voice just enough to sound courteous to anyone who was not paying attention. "Mrs. Hayes, I understand this may be inconvenient, but when cash is involved, we have to follow procedure." Margaret's fingers tightened around the strap of her purse. She had heard that word before. Procedure. It was the kind of word people used when they wanted cruelty to sound respectable. She looked at the thin stack of bills on the counter, each one earned through hours on her feet, through aching knees, through winters spent cleaning homes while other people slept warm and easy. "I have been banking here for 30 years, she said quietly. "I have never had a problem before." Brandon glanced at the screen in front of him as if the numbers might give him permission to keep looking down on her. "There is no appointment on file," he said, louder now, making sure the nearby customers could hear. "And deposits of this size from a customer profile like yours are not something we can process casually." The phrase landed like a slap without a hand. Around the lobby, a few heads turned. A woman in a pearl necklace stopped pretending to read her receipt. A man in a navy suit looked over the top of his glasses. Margaret felt the heat rise in her face, not from anger alone, but from the old familiar shame of being made to feel small in a room built for people who had never been taught to apologize for their comfort. She opened her mouth, then closed it, then tried again. "I brought the money because I needed to pay my property taxes today," she said. "That is all." Brandon gave a thin smile that never reached his eyes. "And you expect us to simply accept that explanation?" he asked. "You arrived with cash in an envelope, no supporting paperwork, and no appointment. You can understand why that raises concerns." Margaret looked at him in silence, and in that silence was her whole life. The bus rides she had skipped to save money, the meals she had cut in half, the extra laundry she had done with cracked hands and no complaints. The small house she refused to lose because it held the memory of the man she had loved and the life they had built with almost nothing. None of that mattered to the young man behind the counter. To him, she was only an old woman in worn shoes, an inconvenience with trembling hands and too many years behind her. Brandon leaned back slightly, satisfied by the discomfort he had created. If someone is helping you manage your finances, perhaps they should be the one to handle this, he said. We take fraud very seriously. Margaret's chin lifted a little at that, the way it always did when she was forced to choose between tears and dignity. No one is helping me, she said, each word careful and steady. And nothing about me is fraudulent. The lobby seemed to narrow around her. Somewhere near the entrance, a door whispered open and closed. The air, already tense, seemed to sharpen. And from the corner of the bank, from the place where a man in a charcoal suit had been watching without moving, a deeper stillness began to form, one that made even Brandon's practiced smile start to falter. Brandon's eyes flicked once toward the man in the charcoal suit, then back to Margaret, as if hoping the room would somehow return to the version of itself where he still had control. But the silence around him had already begun to work against him. It settled over the marble floor, over the polished counters, over the waiting customers who had stopped pretending not to listen. Margaret stood with her purse pressed to her side, her face still wet at the edges, but her spine was straighter now than it had been a minute before. There was something about being doubted in public that made the truth feel heavier in the chest, and she carried hers with both hands. I have been banking here for 30 years, she said softly, but every word landed cleanly. My husband and I opened this account when the branch first came to this neighborhood. We raised 2 children on what he earned loading freight and what I made cleaning houses before dawn. I did not come here for charity. I came here to pay what I owe, the same way I have paid everything else in my life. A woman near the back lowered her eyes. Someone else shifted uncomfortably. Brandon gave a small, dismissive smile that did not reach his face. I am sure your story is very meaningful, Mrs. Hayes, he said. But we still need to verify the source of the funds. Margaret inhaled slowly through her nose, the way she always did when the world tried to push her into smaller pieces. The source is my labor, she said. The source is 50 years of waking up before the sun. The source is every home I scrubbed, every child I cared for, every lunch I skipped so my taxes would be paid on time. Her voice did not rise, and that only made it stronger. Across the lobby, the man in the charcoal suit had not moved, but the attention around him was changing. People were beginning to recognize something in the way he stood, the quiet certainty, the kind of stillness that did not belong to an ordinary customer. Brandon felt it too. His shoulders tightened. He glanced down at the screen in front of him, then back up with a strained laugh. No one is questioning your work ethic, he said, though his tone suggested exactly the opposite. We are simply following bank policy. Margaret's lips parted, then closed again. She had lived long enough to know when an apology was coming too late to matter. She looked at the money spread out on the counter, the bills she had counted 3 times at her kitchen table, the bills that represented nights with sore hands and mornings with aching knees. To see them handled like evidence instead of sacrifice was its own kind of wound. That was when the man in the charcoal suit finally stepped forward. His shoes made almost no sound against the floor, yet the entire bank seemed to hear him. He stopped beside Margaret with the ease of someone who never had to ask permission to enter a room. When he spoke, his voice was low and calm, but it carried across the lobby without effort. Is there a problem here? Brandon's mouth opened, then closed again. He straightened immediately, the color draining from his face as recognition spread across it. Mr. Castellano, he said, too quickly. I did not realize you were waiting. Margaret turned slightly, finally seeing the full shape of the man who had been watching her. He was younger than she had expected, with careful eyes and a face that looked carved from patience rather than warmth. There was something disciplined about him, something that suggested power had taught him to keep his emotions hidden until they were needed. He did not look at Brandon first. He looked at Margaret. Ma'am, he said, and the words sounded more respectful than anything she had heard all morning. Did he refuse your deposit? The question was simple. The answer, when Margaret gave it, was even simpler. Yes, he did. The air changed again. It was not loud. It was worse than loud. It was the kind of quiet that told everyone in the room they were standing on a line they could not see. Brandon swallowed hard. Sir, I was only making sure the transaction was legitimate. The man in the charcoal suit held his gaze for a long moment, then looked at the envelope of cash on the counter. "From what I can see," he said evenly, "the only thing lacking here is your judgment." Brandon opened his mouth, but for once, nothing clever came out. The bank clerk who had spent the last several minutes speaking in rehearsed confidence now looked as though the floor beneath him had quietly disappeared. The man in the charcoal suit did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply stood there with one hand resting near the counter and the other relaxed at his side, every line of him calm, controlled, and impossible to ignore. "You will process her deposit," he said, each word measured and clear, "and then you will apologize to Mrs. Hayes before this conversation goes any further." Margaret remained still, her envelope of cash pressed against the counter, unsure whether she had somehow stepped into a dream. Around her, the other customers had gone completely silent. A woman who had been whispering only moments earlier now stared down at the marble tiles. A man near the window suddenly found his shoes fascinating. Brandon glanced toward the branch office doors, as if hoping someone with more authority would appear and rescue him from the consequences of his own behavior, but no one did. The tall stranger in the charcoal suit had become the center of the room without ever trying to claim it. "Sir," Brandon said, his voice thinner now, "I was only following procedure." The man tilted his head slightly. "Procedure is for protecting customers," he replied, "not for humiliating them." That sentence landed with a quiet force that seemed to press the entire bank into stillness. Margaret felt something in her chest loosen, though she did not yet trust it. She had spent too many years being told to wait, to be patient, to understand, to let things go. But this was different. This stranger had looked at her and seen a person, not a problem. Brandon's face flushed. He reached for the cash with hands that had lost all their earlier certainty, then stopped when the man in the suit spoke again. "And make sure you count it properly this time." Brandon nodded too quickly, his eyes fixed on the bills as though they might save him from having to look at Margaret. The crisp sound of paper being arranged and stacked filled the space between them, each movement awkward now, stripped of the smugness that had colored the exchange before. Margaret watched in silence, still trying to understand why this man cared enough to intervene. She knew better than to assume kindness from powerful people. Life had taught her that lesson too many times. Yet there was something in the way he stood there, unhurried and firm, that told her he was not performing for the room. He meant it. "What is your name, ma'am?" he asked after a moment, his voice softening just slightly. Margaret lifted her chin. "Margaret Hayes." He gave a single nod, as if storing the name somewhere important. "Well, Mrs. Hayes, you came here to do honest business." That should have been enough. The words drew a slight tremor through her hands. Honest business. No one at that bank had spoken to her that way all morning. No one had made her feel as though her labor, her savings, her years still carried value. Brandon finished the deposit and printed the receipt with stiff, shaking fingers. When he slid it across the counter, the man in the charcoal suit did not move aside. He waited until Margaret had taken it in her hand. Then, and only then, did he step back half a pace, giving her the room that should have been hers from the beginning. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his tone now colder toward Brandon than it had ever been toward her, "I would like to know exactly how a customer with 30 years of loyalty is treated like this in one of my banks." Brandon went white. Margaret's head lifted sharply. "My banks." The words hung there, simple and devastating. The room seemed to tilt around that fact, and suddenly every person in line understood what they had been witnessing. The man who had defended her was not just important. He was the owner of the bank's parent company, the kind of man whose decision could change careers with a single sentence. Brandon's mouth opened, but whatever defense he had prepared died before it reached his lips. Margaret looked at the stranger again, truly looked this time, and saw not only the tailored suit and quiet authority, but something else beneath it, a deliberate patience, a depth of control, and an old, guarded kindness that had survived longer than his softness had. "Come with me, Mrs. Hayes," he said gently. "There is someone in my office who would very much like to make sure you are taken care of properly." And as he stepped aside to walk beside her, the entire bank watched a woman who had been dismissed as invisible leave the counter with her dignity restored. By the time Margaret Hayes reached the private office, her hands had finally stopped trembling, though her heart was still moving too fast for comfort. The corridor outside the bank floor was quieter than the lobby, lined with dark wood, muted glass, and the soft scent of polished furniture and expensive paper. The man in the charcoal suit walked beside her with measured steps, not rushing her, not crowding her, as if he understood that dignity sometimes needed room to breathe. "Please sit down," he said, opening the door for her. Margaret hesitated only a moment before easing into the chair across from his desk. It was larger than the one she had at home, smooth and careful to the touch, and she folded her hands in her lap the way her mother had taught her long ago, as if posture itself could hold a person together when the world tried to fold them in half. The man remained standing for a second longer, looking at her with an expression that had softened in a way the bank floor had not been allowed to see. "My name is William Castellano," he said quietly, "and I owe you an apology for what happened out there." Margaret blinked, unsettled by the simple honesty of it. "You do not owe me anything, sir," she said. "You helped me." William's gaze did not leave her face. "I should have stepped in sooner." There was no excuse in his voice, no polished corporate distance, only a directness that made his apology feel real. Margaret lowered her eyes for a moment, then looked back at him. "I have spent most of my life learning not to expect help from people who have no reason to notice me," she said. "So what you did was more than enough." Something changed in William's expression then, small but unmistakable, as if her words had found a place inside him he had kept sealed for years. He moved to the side of the desk and picked up a thin folder, then set it down again without opening it. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "my office manager tells me you came here to pay property taxes on your home." Margaret nodded. "My husband left me that house. It is small, but it is mine. I have worked too hard to let it go over a tax bill." William's jaw tightened slightly, not with anger at her, but at the idea that someone like her had been forced to fight so hard for something so modest. "Then we are going to make sure that never happens," he said. Margaret looked up quickly. "I do not want charity." "It is not charity," he replied. "It is respect." The words settled between them with unusual weight. Outside the office, faint footsteps passed in the hall. Inside, the air felt still, almost reverent. William reached for the intercom, then stopped. "Before I make a few calls," he said, "there is something I want you to know." Margaret waited, sensing that whatever came next mattered. "Brandon Mitchell will no longer be handling customer accounts at this branch," William said evenly. "And after today, neither he nor anyone else will forget what happened here." Margaret did not smile, not yet. She was too careful for that. But her shoulders eased a little, and in the quiet that followed, William noticed the worn envelope still resting in her lap, the one that had carried 6 months of sacrifice, every hidden bus ride, every skipped meal, every aching hand. He looked at it, then back at her. "Would you allow me to help you with something else?" he asked. Margaret studied him for a long moment. "What kind of help?" William folded his hands on the desk, his voice calm, his eyes steady. "The kind that makes sure you never have to stand in that line alone again." Margaret Hayes sat very still in the private office, her worn envelope resting on her lap like something sacred, while the city outside the tall windows moved on without noticing that her whole world had just shifted. The room was quiet in that expensive, careful way wealthy places often were, with polished oak walls, soft lamplight, and a heavy silence that seemed to respect itself. William Castellano stood near the desk, one hand resting at his side, his dark suit sharply cut, his expression unreadable except for the steady attention in his eyes. Margaret had known fear in many forms during her 72 years, but this was different. This was the uneasy feeling of being seen by someone who understood too much. "I do not want charity," she said at last, her voice soft but firm. William looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Good," he said, "because that is not what I am offering." Margaret's fingers tightened around the envelope. "Then what are you offering?" He did not answer right away. Instead, he walked to the window and looked out at the street below, where taxis passed and pedestrians hurried beneath a pale afternoon sky. "When I was a boy," he said quietly, "my grandmother worked until her hands locked up in the winter. She never asked anyone for anything, and people still looked at her as if she did not belong in the room she entered. I promised myself that if I ever had the power to change that, I would." Margaret watched him carefully. There was something in his voice that was not polished or rehearsed. It sounded lived in, real. "You did not know me 5 minutes ago," she said. William turned back to her. "No," he said, "but I knew enough to see that Brandon was wrong." Margaret lowered her eyes for a moment, and when she spoke again, her words were quieter. Men like that have a way of making you feel smaller than you are. William's jaw tightened, just slightly. Then let me be clear, he said. You are not small. You are not a suspicion. You are not a problem to be managed by arrogant clerks who have forgotten basic decency. The words landed gently, but they struck hard all the same. Margaret swallowed, her throat tightening in a way she did not fully trust. No one in a long time had spoken to her, as if she mattered without asking for something in return. William moved back to the desk, picked up a folder, and placed it in front of her without touching her envelope. There is an account option here that includes fee waivers, priority service, and direct assistance for long-term clients, he said. If you want it, I can have it arranged today. Margaret blinked. Why would you do that for me? The question seemed to linger in the warm air between them. William's expression changed, only slightly, but enough that the hardness in him eased. Because people like Brandon count on good people staying quiet, he said. And because I am tired of watching decent people be treated like they are invisible. Margaret looked down at the folder, then back at him. You are a very unusual man, Mr. Castellano. A faint edge of something almost like amusement touched his face. So I have been told. For the first time since the humiliation at the counter, Margaret let out a small breath that was almost a laugh. It surprised her. It even surprised him. And in that brief, delicate moment, the room changed. The air no longer felt like a battlefield of class and cruelty. It felt like the beginning of something quieter and far more dangerous to pride, trust. By the time Margaret Hayes settled into the chair across from William Castellano's desk, the first sting of humiliation had begun to fade, replaced by something more fragile and far more unfamiliar. Respect. It was not loud. It did not announce itself with applause or apology. It lived in the small things, in the way the private office had been prepared, in the clean glass of water placed beside her folder, in the fact that no one had rushed her, corrected her, or spoken to her as if she were a burden. William remained standing for a moment near the window, his dark silhouette cut against the pale afternoon light, as if he were giving her space to decide whether she trusted the moment enough to stay in it. Outside, traffic moved along the street below, horns rising and fading in the distance. But inside the office the silence felt carefully held. Margaret adjusted the strap of her worn purse and looked at the folder in front of her. The bank forms were thick, official, and intimidating in a way that made her feel her age, but they were also fair. That alone surprised her. This would help me keep track of everything, she asked at last, her voice quieter now than it had been at the counter. William nodded once. Yes, and it would give you easier access if you ever need to make a large deposit, transfer money, or speak with someone who actually understands how to treat clients with respect. Margaret's mouth tightened at that, not because she disagreed, but because the memory of Brandon was still fresh enough to sting. She smoothed one hand over the edge of the folder. I have spent most of my life learning how to be useful, she said. No one ever offered me anything like this before. William turned from the window then and looked at her with a steadiness that made it impossible to look away. That is the problem, he said. People assume kindness should only be reserved for people who already have power. Margaret studied him, searching for the polished arrogance she had expected when she first saw the suit, the watch, the calm authority. Instead, she found something stranger. Control, yes, but also restraint. And beneath that, a grief that he kept locked behind his eyes like a private room no one was meant to enter. You speak as if you know that from experience, she said softly. For the first time, William was silent. The answer did not come right away. When it did, it was lower, almost careful. I have seen what happens when decent people are ignored until it becomes convenient to notice them. Margaret let that settle between them. There was no drama in his voice, no performance. Just truth, blunt and clean. She rested her hands in her lap and said, Then perhaps you understand why I did not want to cause trouble today. William's expression hardened just slightly. You did not cause trouble, Mrs. Hayes. He did. That simple correction landed harder than any speech could have. Margaret looked down and blinked once, slow and thoughtful. My husband used to say the same thing, she murmured. William did not interrupt. He would tell me that if someone embarrassed me in public, I should not rush to make myself smaller just to keep the peace. The corners of her mouth trembled with the beginning of a memory. He was a good man. I am sure he was, William said. And in that moment, his voice carried an unfamiliar gentleness. one that made the room feel less like a bank office and more like a place where someone might actually be heard. Margaret reached for the pen beside the folder, then stopped. If I accept this, does it mean I have to trust the bank again? William's mouth tilted faintly. No, he said. It means you get to decide whether the bank earns your trust from now on. Margaret let out a slow breath, the kind that came from somewhere deep and tired. For the first time in years, she did not feel like she was standing at the mercy of a system designed to overlook her. She felt, instead, like a woman being given back a small piece of authority she had never asked to lose. And William, watching her sign her name with careful, steady strokes, understood something else as well. Sometimes the most dangerous thing a man of power could do was treat dignity like a gift instead of a right. By the time Margaret Hayes reached the quiet hallway outside William Castellano's private office, the sound of the bank behind them had faded into a low, distant hum, as if the entire building had decided to hold its breath. She walked more slowly now, not because her legs were weak, but because she was trying to understand the strange new weight of being treated with care after being handled like a problem only minutes earlier. William did not speak right away. He simply guided her toward a leather chair beside a side table where someone had placed fresh water, a folded napkin, and a small silver dish of wrapped mints, details so careful they almost felt unreal. Margaret looked at them, then at him, her expression guarded but no longer afraid. You really do this for everyone? She asked quietly. William's eyes remained on her face. No, he said. Only when someone deserves better than what they were given. That answer settled between them like a truth spoken too late in life, and Margaret lowered herself into the chair with a careful exhale. For a moment, neither of them moved. The afternoon light came through the narrow window in a soft stripe, catching the silver in her bun and the polished edge of his desk beyond the door. Somewhere outside, a printer whirred. Somewhere farther away, a cashier laughed too loudly, as if the world had not changed at all. But inside that office, something had shifted in a way neither of them could name yet. William opened the file he had asked his assistant to prepare, then paused before speaking, his voice calm and measured. Mrs. Hayes, there is something else I should tell you. Margaret's fingers tightened around the edge of her purse. She had already been through enough for one morning, and the words coming next felt important in a way she could sense before she understood them. William set the folder aside and leaned back slightly, studying her with that steady expression that made it difficult to look away. The branch manager will be handling the rest of your deposit personally. There will be no questions, no delays, and no more disrespect. Margaret nodded once, though her throat was still tight. That would have been nice an hour ago, she said, and for the first time, a hint of dry humor touched her voice. William's mouth shifted, almost into a smile. I know. Then his expression grew serious again. But I am not only interested in fixing what happened in the lobby. I want to know how someone like you ended up having to fight so hard for something so simple. Margaret looked down at her hands. The question was gentle, but it reached places she had kept sealed for years. Because people see an old woman and think time has made her harmless, she said at last. They forget that being overlooked is its own kind of injury. William said nothing. He only listened, and that silence gave her permission to continue. She told him about the extra cleaning jobs, about the buses she walked past to save a few dollars, about the late husband who had built their little house with his own hands, and the taxes she had refused to let go unpaid. As she spoke, the office grew quieter, as if even the air had become respectful. When she finished, William remained still for a long moment. Then he said, You should not have had to prove any of that to anyone. Margaret lifted her eyes to his. And yet I did. William's gaze sharpened, not with anger now, but with resolve. Not again, he said softly. Not if I can help it. He reached for the intercom, then stopped before pressing it, as though the next step mattered more than he wanted to admit. There is a community trust fund connected to the bank, he said. It helps longtime customers with property tax relief, emergency support, and financial guidance. Most people never hear about it unless they already know the right person. Margaret stared at him, uncertain whether to hope. Why are you telling me this? William met her eyes. Because someone should have told you years ago. The room went still. Margaret felt the words land with unexpected force, not because they were grand, but because they were true. For so long, she had lived as if dignity was something other people could grant or withhold. Now, Sitting in a quiet office with a powerful man speaking to her like she mattered, she began to understand that dignity was not a favor. It was a standard. And William, watching her absorb that truth, knew the afternoon had already become about something larger than one apology, larger than one deposit, larger than one bank. By the time Margaret Hayes stepped back into the daylight outside First National Bank, the afternoon had changed color. What had begun as a humiliating morning now felt strangely different, as if the air itself had been cleared by one honest act of correction. She held her purse a little more steadily now, and although the worn leather still rested against her hip, it no longer felt like a burden. William Castellano walked beside her at an easy pace, his dark suit catching the sun, his expression guarded but calm. Behind them, the bank doors opened and closed with ordinary sounds. But for Margaret, nothing about the day felt ordinary anymore. "I still do not understand why you did all of this," she said softly, looking ahead instead of at him. William let the silence sit for a moment before answering. "Because people like Brandon learn bad habits when no one corrects them," he said. "And because people like you should never have to prove they deserve basic respect." Margaret gave a small, tired smile at that, the kind that carried decades of endurance in it. She had spent most of her life believing that dignity had to be defended quietly, one small sacrifice at a time. Now, after one cruel exchange in a bank line and one unexpected act of courage from a man she had assumed would never notice her, she was beginning to see something else. Respect was not a luxury reserved for the powerful. It was a duty owed to every person who walked through a door. They reached the curb where a black sedan waited, its polished surface reflecting the sky. William opened the door for her himself, and Margaret hesitated just long enough to realize how rare that simple gesture felt. "I can manage," she said, though she did not pull away. "I know you can," William replied. "That is not the point." She looked at him then, really looked at him, seeing not the rumors people whispered about him, not the reputation that followed him like a shadow, but the steady attention in his eyes. There was power in him, certainly, but there was also restraint. There was something almost careful about the way he spoke to her, as if he understood that kindness meant more when it was offered without spectacle. Margaret settled into the seat, smoothing her skirt with one hand, and William closed the door with a quiet finality. As the car pulled away from the curb, she turned toward the window and watched the bank shrink behind her. It no longer looked like a place of judgment. It looked like a place that had finally been forced to remember itself. William stood on the sidewalk for a moment longer, one hand resting in his pocket, his gaze following the car until it disappeared into traffic. He was thinking about the ease with which one young employee had tried to strip an elderly woman of her dignity, and how quickly a room of strangers had almost allowed it to happen. That thought stayed with him. It bothered him more than he cared to admit. Inside the bank, Brandon Mitchell had been removed from the counter and sent to the branch manager's office, where the conversation waiting for him was not likely to be kind. But William had already decided that punishment alone was not the answer. Consequences mattered, yes, but so did the chance to learn. By the time he reached his own car, he had already instructed the bank to review its customer service policies, retrain every frontline employee, and add clearer protections for elderly clients. He wanted change that lasted after the embarrassment faded. Margaret did not know any of that yet. All she knew was that for the first time in a long time, she had left a bank with her head held high and her money untouched by shame. When William glanced at her before getting into the car behind, she gave him a slow nod of gratitude that needed no translation. He returned it with a faint, almost reluctant smile. In that quiet exchange, something settled between them, not romance, not obligation, but a deeper understanding. One person had been seen. One person had chosen to see. And that was enough to alter the shape of an ordinary afternoon forever.